So, welcome back. Some of the more contemporary scholars around race that have contributed to this discussion, folks like Joe Fagan, Eduardo Bonilla Silva, and many others will be discussing and engaging with their research now and in the next few weeks. Another text that I think is very important to read when discussing race is called Racist America, and it is by Joe Fagan. And so, the theory that we are looking to talk about is the theory of systemic racism. And the reason why I think it's important to talk about systemic racism is because that is the way in which we look at race. So a lot of times when people define racism or they're explaining racism, they look at it on an individual level. If one person treats another person negatively because of the color of their skin, then they're racist. And while that is one way of describing racism, racism is not just an individual behavior, but it is also systems, it is also structures. And so that you can have people that are not racist, but systems that are racist that can still perpetuate racial inequality. And so that's essentially what we're going to talk about today is systemic racism based on the study and the ideas of Joe Fagan. This piece called Racist America was done because during the time in which it was written and then published, many people were asking the question, why are we still talking about race? We can understand Du Bois. Du Bois did Souls of Black Folk it was published in 1903, The Dark Water 1930s. I mean, people are just coming out of Harlem Renaissance. You're still dealing with issues related to lynching. Black people don't still have voting rights. They still don't have civil rights. We can understand 1930, 1995, 1998, 1999, 2000. Why are we still talking about race? It's way past the civil rights movement, right? Dr. King and the movement of the 60s and Malcolm X and Medgar Evers and Angela Davis and many others have already fought for these things. Why are we still talking about it? I mean, we're literally seeing Oprah Winfrey. We're literally seeing Jay-Z. This is almost a decade before we would see the first Black president. Why are we still talking about race? Isn't racism done away with? Haven't we dealt with this by now? Why is racism still a thing? Number one, why are Black people or people of color still talking about race? And number two, why do they have to? Haven't we done enough to address this issue? So that's the question. And so Fagan says, well, let's look at this thing historically. Let's find out why race and racism is still an issue in this country to finally get to the bottom of it. So what he does is, instead of doing what he would probably normally do, go and do interviews and things like that, he looks at this, he does a historical analysis of race and goes all the way back to the foundation of the country to find elements of race within the core properties of the creation of the United States of America. And what we're going to do is we're going to just kind of introduce ourselves to some of his findings to answer that question. Why are we still talking about race? Black people and white people can get married. We have other racial groups now. They can get married. They can become citizens. Why? But first, let's look at the foundation for racism. All right? First, let's look at that. If you look back at colonial times, for a large part of racial history, both Northerners and Southerners were pro-slavery. A lot of times in history, we like to say, well, issue of slavery and racism, that's a Southern thing. Even now, people usually, when they think about issues related to racial inequality, they're like, oh, that's that stuff they deal with in the South, in Florida and Georgia, and in those Republican countries, and in those red states, and North Carolina. Well, now Georgia's blue, but and Florida's kind of swings from red to blue sometimes, or at least different cities will, key cities in Florida, right? Alabama, Mississippi. It's like, oh, that's that stuff they deal with down there. We don't have to, that's not a Northern thing. No, not necessarily. So first thing that Fagan does is he says, racism is an American thing. Both Northerners and Southerners were pro-slavery at one point. And both regions profited from the system. And he doesn't really go into this. This is more so my studies. But the only reason why slavery did not persist in the North was because geographically it was not profitable. Geographically, it just didn't work. It was just too cold. It was too cold, and the terrain was not conducive for slavery. That was really the only reason. If it were not for that, and for a long time slavery was in the North, if it were not for that, they would have continued to participate in it as well. It's just that the South geographically was more conducive. The weather was more conducive to maintain slavery. And then what ended up happening, according to Fagan, is that all of these raw materials from the South are now being shipped up north to, because remember, you're talking about the Industrial Revolution. We talked about that a couple lectures ago. Now you're taking all this raw cotton, all these raw materials, and you're making shirts and pants and pillows and blankets, hats. And then guess what you're going to do? You're going to sell it back to the South, or you're going to sell it overseas. So the North is making a lot of money off of these raw materials that are being picked by these African people. So it's not that Northerners weren't completely against anti-slavery. They definitely wanted it, many of them. Right? And so the first thing that Fagan does is he makes it known both regions profited off of slavery and the system of racism and the system of hatred, and it was not just a Southern thing. He goes on to talk about how during that time, race was connected to property. And property is the main object of society. Even if you look at some of the early phrasings of within the United States, over time they changed the phrasing from life, liberty, and property to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But initially, it was said that all people had the right to life, liberty, and property. And property was code word for slavery. See, they didn't want to put slave in these documents because they knew that these documents would last for the way past them, Jefferson and Hamilton and all of these people. So they didn't want to mention slavery in the documents, in the Declaration of Independence, in the Constitution, in the Bill of Rights. So there's this coded language that exists that means slave, that means enslaved person, but they don't actually say it because slavery is still very much taboo. In fact, a lot of people didn't know the extent to which slavery was horrendous until the book Uncle Tom's Cabin came out. It was literally like the social media of that day. Because now people are reading this book and they're like, oh my goodness. Oh, that's how these people are being treated? I know slavery existed. I didn't know it was this bad. I didn't know these people were literally like not being treated as if they're human. It's kind of difficult to believe, but that's what's said in a lot of history books. Right? So it was literally the social media of the day. In fact, Abraham Lincoln goes on record saying talking about the Civil War, and he kind of humorly, you know, in a humorous fashion states, you know, this war was caused by, talking about the Civil War, was caused by this woman right here. He's talking about Harriet Beecher Stowe, the woman who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. So he's kind of like, she the one started this war, right? But slavery was still a very taboo thing. It wasn't something that the United States flaunted proudly. But if you knew about it, then you knew about it. And so property was a code word. And it is actually found in the documents that, and you can see that property is a key element of American society, and being able to control property, which means being able to control a person. And African people were looked at as people and not, as property and not people. So at the Constitutional Convention, there is this push for freedom. The freedom was the protection of property that produced a profit. That was one of the elements of freedom at the early constitutional conventions. Some people argue that police do the same thing, that they protect property and not always people. And then a lot of people are looked at as property, especially if they're workers and not owners. And so then they're protected, or they're given, and Marx talks about this, just enough for them to continue to create a profit for the bourgeoisie, for the owners. Also, the response then would be, well, there were a lot of people who were anti-slavery, even during the time of slavery. A lot of people were anti-slavery, and yes, that's very true. But Fagan goes on to say, according to his historical research, even those people who opposed slavery did not do it on the basis of morality and humanity. They actually opposed slavery because they felt it would affect the defense of the nation, basically saying slavery makes white men lazy. These white men don't have to work if they have enslaved Africans, African people working for them. Okay, well, what's wrong with that? Well, if we get attacked by the French, if we get attacked by the Germans, if we get attacked by the Spanish, who's going to fight? We're not going to let African people fight for us. We're not going to let the blacks fight. Their property. And if we let them fight, then that means we have to treat them and respect them as defenders of our nation. That means we can't treat them this way after they get done fighting for us. So the only people that can fight for us are white men. But if they're not prepared to fight because they're so lazy, they've gotten fat, they've gotten lazy because people are working for them, they won't be able to defend this nation. So we may want to reconsider slavery, not because we want to give Black people freedom or because of the moral reasons, but because it's not good for white men. And so this is what Fagan finds in a lot of his research. The idea of racism or the idea of anti-racism is not as prevalent in early documents as we might think. And even anti-racism was steeped in white-centeredness. And then he also argues that within these early documents, you see that there's a justification for oppression on all fronts. It was based on natural law. There was this idea, and this again goes to what Fredrickson talks about in Short History of Race. There's this justification for the enslavement of African people. Why? They are naturally second-class citizens. They are naturally subordinate to white people. There is also this justification for the genocide of Native Americans and subordination of women based on what was called, and you probably seen or heard about this in your history books, manifest destiny. God has blessed, and this is what Weber talks about in the Protestant ethics, God has blessed white people. God has blessed Europeans. It is within God's will for white people, for Europeans to expand, to grow, to become rich, to become wealthy, to spread his word, to spread his teachings, to spread what is right and what is good. And the people that are able to do this are white people. So it is necessary for them to be in positions of power and positions of superiority. And anything we can do to continue to make that happen, we must do. Why? Because it is the natural way of things. It is the natural law. It is the way God intended. And so even again, if we go to anti-Black racism, what Fagan argues is that essentially what he's arguing in this section is that the foundation for this democracy is anti-Black racism. He says 10, and this is actually the argument for the whole book. He says 10 US presidents, the founder of American psychiatry, the founder of the Quakers, one of the earliest liberal religious organizations in the country, all of these people owned or participated in the ownership of Black Americans at some point. Ten out of the first 16 presidents, that's a lot, that's over half, participated in slavery. Then he goes on to say policies like the 3/5 Compromise, the Fugitive Slave Act, and many others are found in the early documents of this country. This is a part of the foundation of this country. Even Lincoln himself said that he would make slavery permanent if it meant that he didn't have to go to war with the South. So essentially, Fagan is saying this country is founded on racist ideologies and by people who practice racism. That's why it's called Racist America. He's saying racism is a part of the very foundation of what this country is all about. You cannot separate the two. You can't separate America from its history. You can't separate America from British history because it's a part of it. Then eventually it goes this way. But there is that link because it was a British colony, and you cannot separate America from racism. It's a part of the makeup of this country, and he proves it by going into the documents, by showing you policies, by if you were to go to Washington, D.C. and look at some of the original papers of the United States, you will see these documents that say Black people are 3/5 of human beings, and using that to justify why they can only send a certain amount of people to Congress in the South. You will see the Fugitive Slave Act, which says any Black person leaving the South and going to anywhere south of the Canadian borderline must be sent back to the South, meaning that a Black person is enslaved in every boundary of the United States. Thus, confirming and validating what Fagan said earlier, which was racism is not just a Southern problem, it's an American problem, right? There was a time where people could run to Philadelphia and be safe. Then, once Philadelphia was cut off and they expanded those fugitive slave borderlines, they could go to New York and be safe. And then they expanded it once again with the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, and then it expanded to Canada. So African people that ran away from the South had to run all the way to Canada in order to ensure their freedom. So this is why Fagan says that the very foundation of our country, the United States, is built on race and racism. And then he goes on to say that the eradication of slavery did not necessarily do away with the belief in white supremacy. So a lot of people believe, well, then we fought the Civil War and then it was done away with. Well, no. What was done away with to an extent, this is why the new Jim Crow and slavery by another name is our pieces that we deal with. The Civil War did away with, did away with slavery. It did not do away with white supremacy. It did not do away with racism. It did not do away with white hatred. Okay. So this is why Fagan says it's important for us to differentiate the two. You can't confound them. Just because slavery is done away with doesn't mean racism is. But some people argue that slavery and racism was so normal at that time that it would be unfair to judge them or label them racist because it was a part of their everyday life. And that's an interesting question to pose to you. Do you think that early people, particularly white people, your George Washingtons, your Thomas Jeffersons, and these are just the big names. We're not even talking about your regular farmers. Should they be blamed for having negative thoughts about Black folks, for participating in slavery? It was everywhere. It would be like participating in social media. It was everywhere. Some people may say they didn't even realize they were doing anything wrong because they were raised in this. Everybody did it. So maybe they shouldn't have to take responsibility for these actions because it was such a part of their everyday life. And so if we go to the next section, next slide, we see that while that may be true to some degree, I tend to believe that if you're smart enough to start your own country and fight one of the most powerful countries in the world to establish your own country, your own democracy, your own institutions, your own way of life, I think a person is smart enough to say whether it's right or wrong to chain and work and rape and kill another group of people. So it's difficult for me to think that that didn't cross their mind. But if we want to, just to play devil's advocate, okay, let's say we wanted to say, well, these people were, inculcated and they, this is a part of their culture. Okay, some people may say we should give them the benefit of the doubt. Well, that's not necessarily what Fagan is arguing when it comes to systemic racism, because while, yes, all the people who participated in slavery, all the people who participated in the early years of Jim Crow, they're dead now. We're not necessarily talking about individual behaviors. We're talking about what racism, what Fagan says is systemic racism. The problem is not racist words or thoughts. In fact, most people of color probably don't care what you think about them or what you say in your private time about them. That doesn't matter as much as what can actually be done to them on a structural level. It is systems and it is structures that keep people of color in a position of inferiority. This is systemic racism. And so when we talk about systemic racism, we're talking about the diverse assortment of practices that exist that create the unjustly gained economic and political power of white people, the continuing resource of inequalities, and the white racist ideologies, the attitudes and institutions created to preserve white advantages and power. So essentially, the practices that have happened that have allowed for white people to have economic power over people of color. When you're talking about the accessing and bequeathing of wealth over generations, when you're talking about people who have maintained their family wealth that can date all the way back to slavery. So slavery was a wealth-producing institution for white people and a wealth-depleting institution for Black people. When you're talking about political power of whites, where for a long time, and we talked about this already, white people were gaining and maintaining political power because they were the only ones that could vote, white men particularly, and then not until 1965 could Black people vote. So that means that all of those politicians who gained power, they all gained power unjustly because everybody could not vote. And we can even make a claim now that it's still that way because people who are former felons or people who were formerly incarcerated are not allowed to, many of them still can't vote. But all of this economic and political power of white people have been unjustly gained because there were rules and policies and vigilantes that did not allow for everyone to have the same access to voting, to jobs, to wealth building. And then the continuing resource of inequality. So continuing this through the new Jim Crow, through educational segregation, through residential segregation. All of those things that you saw in the video. It's how these resources continue, how these unequal resources continue. And then the white racist ideologies and the ideas, the attitudes that are embodied by white people who may or may not be in power, but who will be in power, and then become senators, become congressmen, become presidents, become leaders. And then they lead institutions with these racist ideologies and behaviors that continue to preserve white advantage and power. And this is how the system continues. So essentially, what systemic racism is saying is that it's not just about how people act on an individual level, it's how structures continue to preserve white advantage. And see, if we go back to slavery, many white people, even at that time, disagreed with slavery and the slave trade, but most white people still participated in it or participated in the slave trade. And so when we talk about racism, and even when we talk about slavery, most white Americans, even today, would look at this time period as a mistake that was made. This was one of America's longest sins. This was a mistake. We should not have done this. And they look at it as a sin, as a mistake, but not as the country's foundation. Not as a building block for why America and how America is as powerful as it is today. And so every aspect of society is shaped to some degree by core racist realities, meaning that those who dominate the economic system, those who create the political system, the religious leaders, the legal systems, the media conglomerates, the major families, the educational systems, all of these things are linked to slavery, slave policy, and white on black domination. Whether you're talking about Plessy versus Ferguson or Brown v. Board, whether you're talking about the ways in which religion was taught to white people and to black people and having separate churches, whether you're talking about stereotypes and controlling images within the media. We can go on and on and on, and we'll talk about a lot of this stuff in this class. But all of these are dominated by either slavery, slave policies, or white on black domination, which is the foundation for all of these major institutions, whether it be health institutions, banking institutions, and on and on. And so that's what we mean when we talk about systemic racism. And then in addition to that, then we talk about how does this continue? And then how does this become an individualized problem? And then to look at that is to look at, well, how does this get started in the first place? How can somebody be racist? Well, the first way to do it is to first dehumanize the person. Dehumanization is the psychological dynamic of systemic racism. Meaning, in order for you to be racist towards a person, you first have to not see them as human. But that doesn't just stop with racism. That's any type of oppression. There's a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire. And he talks about that. And he says that oppression is one person having complete control over a person's life and work. So if you look at it from a class standpoint, when the worker is separated from his or her work, that's class oppression. That's what Marx is talking about. The proletariat not having any control over their own work, not having complete control over the labor that they put out. That's class oppression. Why? Because the bourgeoisie, the owners, the super rich, don't see an employee as a person. They see an employee as a conduit to profit. And if I can look at them as a conduit to profit, as separate from their work, I don't see them as a human being. I just see them as what I need to work, what I need to make a profit. So when I separate the worker from the work that they're doing, I dehumanize them. A sexist society means you separate a woman from their body. And when you separate a woman from her body and you don't see that a woman should have control over her own body, then it's easy to pass laws to control their bodies. It's easy to pass laws to make rapists or sexual assault perpetrators get less time than a drug dealer. It sends a message to women saying that we see you as a collection of body parts. So when you separate a woman from her body, when you separate a worker from their work, when you separate a person of a certain race from their rights, you don't see them as a person or as people or as a group or as a nation. You see them as whatever it is that you think you need them for to become successful. You need them for entertainment, so you see them as entertainment, and then once they stop entertaining you, then they're pushed to the side. We don't want you to vote. We don't want you to protest. We don't want you to have it. We want you to do what we want you to do. Whether it be a worker, whether it be a woman, seeing a woman as just a sexual object, meaning I don't see you as a human being. I just see you as a conduit for pleasure, for male pleasure. Or you see people of color as a conduit for workers or a conduit for entertainment, and not people who deserve to have access to citizenship and property and rights and voting and education. So when a person loses control over their inalienable human rights and identity, that is a part of dehumanization, and that is the foundation and the psychological dynamic of racism. See, when we think about biological racism, which we'll talk more about when we talk about colorblind racism and Eduardo Bonilla Silva's work, Racism Without Racists, biological racism says that all men are created equal, but these are not considered men. They're not considered human. So when you fail to see the humanity in someone, it becomes easy to overlook unfair immigration laws. It becomes easy to overlook police brutality. It becomes easy to overlook poor housing in schools or lynching or other racialized social problems because you're not seeing a human being, you're seeing property. You're seeing something that is less than human, an animal, sometimes even something that's less than an animal. That is why dehumanization is a psychological dynamic of systemic racism. And so if we go down to the last slide, Fagan talks about, so then what are the effects of this racist foundation? Some of the effects are, number one, the system of slavery stimulated the economy. See, some people say, well, we can't blame white people in 2021 for what was done in 1821. It's not their fault. They didn't live during slavery. They didn't live during segregation. They didn't live during the Native American genocide. Is it the problem of the white people in this class? Should we hate white people now for what was done in the past? It's not about that. It's not about hating anybody. There is no room for hatred, and at least for me, I don't teach hatred at all. I think many of your professors would agree. Many people who are writing these books would agree. There's not a teaching of hatred or a teaching of blame. There's an understanding of history and understanding the effects. Why do we have to talk about slavery and racism? Because the effects of it can still be felt today. It's about acknowledging a system of racism and white supremacy that has led to US privilege, that has led to white privileges and current ideas about racism. The reason why the United States is so rich is because of racism. It's because of slavery. If you have any person that works for you for free for 2 years, you will be rich. Just one person worked for you for free. Did everything you needed them to do for you for free. You didn't have to pay them. If UNF did not have to pay any of their workers, any of their professors, anybody, they'll be the richest university in the world. If you run a business, or if your parents run a business, or you know someone who runs a business, what will they tell you is the most expensive line item in their budget? Employees, their pay scale. We have to pay the people who work for us. That's the most expensive line item. They're not going to work if they're not getting paid. So you have to pay these people. But if you don't, and you get to profit everything that you were going to pay, well, you'll be rich in no time. Now imagine doing that for 200 and something years with 1 million, well, probably way more than 1 million people, but with 1 million people, you can't help but be the richest country in the world. So slavery stimulated the economy. China is actually the richest country in the world without slavery. But because the US has so many institutions, so much business, so banks, just everything that was started with slave labor, slave money, and slave resources, this continues to be the richest country in the world. Also, the effects of a racist foundation stimulated generational personal wealth. There's a book called The Hidden Cost of Being African American. And what is found in that study is that a good number of wealthy or even just middle class white people, when you ask them to go back far enough, can tell you, and they don't just necessarily have to live in the South, can tell you that the money from their family to some degree was stimulated or expanded because of either a slave foundation or some type of unequal laws that favored them. Particularly the GI Bills of the 1950s and 60s. These GI Bills allowed for soldiers who went off to war in World War II and in the Korean Wars to come back. And when they came back, they got free houses, they got free college education, free housing, and money. So a lot of probably your grandparents, great-grandparents benefited from that. That's actually how suburbia was built, because a lot of these white soldiers lived in the inner city. And when they got those GI Bills, they got houses that were built on the outskirts of the city. They went to college for free, they opened their businesses, they got money, they got jobs, and then they were able to pass money on to their next generation. And then you're probably the generation after that. Your parents probably benefited from what their parents were able to get from the GI Bill. Especially if you come from a family that has a history of participating in military. My grandfather did fight in the Korean War or World War II, one of them, Korean War, World War II. He didn't get the GI Bill because he was Black. So he grew up in the projects. No, well, his family grew up in the projects. And then in the more poor working class area of Jacksonville. So because he was Black, he could not get that GI Bill. So he didn't have the same access to the resources that the white soldiers that he fought alongside did. So generational wealth was passed through the white soldiers, and through the Black soldiers, they did not. Again, a part of what Fagan calls a racist foundation, right? Another effect of a racist foundation is colorblind racism. Colorblind racism, meaning newer forms of racism that are not as explicit as biological racism, saying that people of a certain race are bad or are evil or are criminals or whatever. But now it says, well, I don't see race. I don't see color. That's colorblind racism. I'm going to talk more about that later. But that is a newer form of racism that is an effect of the older forms of a racist foundation. And then lastly, internalized oppression. Racism is not just enter between races, but it also happens within racial groups. It leads some racial groups to differentiate themselves from other people within their own race. We prefer the lighter skinned people of our race. We prefer the darker skinned people of our race. We prefer the people of our race that have a certain type of hair, straight hair, not the curly hair, not the nappy hair. We prefer the people that speak like this, that don't speak ghetto. All of these are examples of internalized oppression, taking on these racist ideas that were put on by the outside groups, the dominant groups, and then repurposing, reinventing, reusing these ideas among each other to participate in what does Patillo call it? Oh, I forgot. Secondary marginalization. Continued division among people of color. All these are effects of a racist foundation, which leads Joe Fagan to then make the conclusion, you know what? The reason why race is still a problem in our country is because it's a part of our foundation. And anything that is a part of a foundation has to be dealt with at a foundational level. If you build a house and the foundation is off, no matter what you do to the walls, no matter how many times you fix the roof, no matter what you do, that something's always going to be wrong with that house. You can fix it and it may last for 5 years or 10 years, but eventually the foundation is going to cause something to slide again. If there's a crack in the foundation, that house is going to always be off. What do you have to do to fix it? You got to tear the house down. And you got to fix that foundation again. That's what some people would argue. That's the best way to ensure that a foundation is solid so that when you build the house, it stands forever. That's why when you see buildings, when people build houses, for a long time, you don't see anything. Because when they're building down. Why? Because they want to make sure that the foundation is solid. And so they'll build down and they'll build under and they'll do all these things for months and months and months and months and months. And you're like, what are they doing over there? And then literally in 2 weeks, a building is up and you're like, whoa, how did that happen? The rest of it, it takes no time. But that foundation, if it's not right, the building is not going to be right. Fagan says America's foundation is off. It's racist. And so that's why the problem with America will never be, the racist problem in America, the problem of racism in America will never be fixed until And he suggests we tear the system down and rebuild our institutions, rebuild our government, rebuild our banking, rebuild our healthcare system, rebuild our education system with a non-racist foundation. That's the only way that we can really rid ourselves of this problem. So something to think about. If you think that Fagan is right about it, if you think that he's wrong, if you have any other suggestions for dealing with the issue or the problem of race in America, if you agree with him, disagree with him, and some of your ideas, just something to think about. So I hope you've enjoyed this lecture. Feel free to comment, reach out to me, inbox, email, or see me during my office hours. I hope you have a great day, great week, great weekend, and see you soon.